So your system may have a large amount of water that generates revenue and a small amount that doesn't, and we just call that water that doesn't generate revenue non-revenue water. Or you may be half and half, where half of the water is generating revenue and half of it isn't. Or you may be a lot of non-revenue water with very little revenue water. So you could be anything in between these, but it's just trying to show you that the water you supply, some of it is going to generate revenue and some of it is not. And no matter how good your utility is, there's always going to be at least a small portion of non-revenue water. And you'll see why as we move through the presentation. You just hope that that non-revenue water is small enough so that it isn't creating a big problem for your utility, such as the bar on the right. You can see if you look at this one over here, that would be quite a problem if most of our water is not generating revenue for us. Now, if we look at our revenue water, that's both billed authorized water. So we have some billed metered customers. So these are customers, they receive a water bill from us. They also have a meter, so we can go out and read the meter and figure out how much water they use. You may bill them based on the volume they use, or you may bill them just a flat fee. It doesn't matter. In the water auditing tool, if it's metered, it falls into this category. So if you have meters and you read them, it would be billed metered usage. Or you can have customers that get a bill, but they're not metered. So you may have some customers in your system that you just give them a flat fee of $20 a month, $30 a month, something like that, and you don't have a meter to tell them how much water they're using. Or you can have some combination of both, where some of the customers are billed and metered and some of the customers are billed but not metered. Now if we focus on the non-revenue portion of the water, there's three main components that we want to consider. The first one is authorized unbilled consumption. The second one is theft and errors. And the third one is real losses. So each of those categories can be broken down a little further. So if we look at our authorized unbilled customers, we have customers that are unbilled but receive a meter. So think about who these customers might be in your system. So if you have a customer such as a governmental building, a park that you're watering, swimming pool that you fill up for the community, any kind of thing that it's a community function, community purpose, you provide them water, the water goes through a meter that you can read, but they don't get a bill at the end. It might also be your water utility building, that perhaps the building itself doesn't, you don't bill yourself for using water in the building, that kind of thing. So any customer that does not receive a bill but does get a meter falls in here. The next type is unbilled but unmetered consumption. The type of consumption that falls in here are things like flushing for water quality purposes, firefighting, street sweeping, sewer cleaning, things that are not permanent uses. They're temporary uses that you do it today, but you're not going to do it again for, maybe another couple of months. But if you're flushing or firefighting, it might be over here or over there in your system. So those aren't typically metered in the traditional sense. You may have a temporary meter on them, but in the traditional sense, they don't have a permanent meter installed. So any flow like that falls in the unbilled, unmetered category. If we move on to theft and errors, we have theft. This is people who are stealing water from your utility. They might be stealing it by tampering with the meter, taking the meter out, putting the meter in backwards, illegally connecting to your pipes, or they might be taking it out of fire hydrants without paying for it. Another category is customer meter errors. So you have a meter on your customers, but perhaps that meter is not reading correctly. It's maybe under reading, so you're not getting all the volume you should, or perhaps it's the wrong type of meter and it can't read low flows or something like that. So you're not getting all of the information you should, so those customer meter errors show up here. And then finally we have systematic data handling errors. This is anything related to how you manage your data. So you might take manual readings, you write that reading down by hand, somebody takes that handwritten information and puts it into a computer. Then that computer takes the information and might do something else with it and spit it out into another format. And in the process of collecting information, transferring information, you might create some errors. There are also some errors that get created just because of the billing system and the way it's set up. So there might be things that happen in your billing system that just create errors for you that are related to just the data. Then our real losses are leaks on our mains, service line leaks, and leakage and overflows at our storage tanks. So a bit about the terminology that we use. If we think about the things that make up theft and error, again, that's our theft, our customer meter errors, and our systematic data handling errors, we actually term this apparent losses. The reason we call it apparent losses is it looks like physical losses. It looks like water leaking from pipe, but it isn't. This water actually reaches a user. So even in case of theft, somebody is using that water. It may not be somebody you want to use the water or you don't want them taking it out of your system, but they are actually using the water. It's not physically being lost from the system through a crack or a break in a pipe. These volumes aren't counted because things like theft, we don't know how much they have stolen. With our meter errors, until we go out and measure the meters, we don't, or check the meters, we don't know how much loss is in the meters. So we're not getting the volumes out of this, and our water is not generating us revenue. This type of water is valued at the price we charge our customers. So our customer retail rate is used to value this. And the reason we do that is that theoretically somebody could have paid for this water. If they weren't stealing it, they would have had to pay at the price we normally charge customers. If the meter was accurate, they would have had to pay for the full volume that passed for the meter. And if our data handling systems were working correctly, the bills would have sent out the right amount of money, and we would have been able to generate the revenue. So on the real loss side, our main leaks, our service line leaks, and our storage tank overflows and leaks are what we term real losses. These are physical losses. This is water that is not reaching a user or a customer. It's leaking from a break, a hole, a fitting. It's leaking somewhere out of our system and we're not able to use it. It's not possible to measure this water. Part of it is underground. We don't know how long a leak has been going on. It could start out as a very small leak that maybe had gone on for months before we actually found it. So we're not really able to measure the water. Even in the cases where the water comes up to the surface, we're not able to measure all the water we lose this way. And this water does not generate revenue. We're not able to send a bill to somebody for the breaks that occur in our pipe prior to the meter. This water is actually valued at the price of producing the water. So we're not going to value at the customer rate. We're going to value it at the rate that it cost us to make it. So we're going to look at things like the energy and the chemical costs that went into producing the water, and we value it at what we call the variable production rate, which is the dollars per million gallons that it costs to create that water that we're leaking from the pipe. We can't directly charge for these losses, but all customers pay indirectly because we have to have revenue that offsets all of our expenses. It costs us something to make the water, so some way, somehow, our customers are going to have to indirectly pay with maybe a slightly higher base bill or a slightly higher volumetric charge to cover the leaks that are going through our system. So you can see how this is both a blue problem, water leaking from pipes, and a green problem because we are losing some revenue and charging our customers to create this water. So we put all that together in a slightly different order. We start with our volume from owned sources, and we look at the fact that we might import some water, and that becomes our system inputs. Then our system inputs go to either water we export or water we supply to our system, or a combination of both. Some of that water is authorized consumption, meaning we want people to use it. We're acknowledging that people use it, and some of it is water losses. This is the case where we don't really want the water going in these categories. Our authorized consumption includes our billed authorized consumption, and that's the water we export, the water we bill that's metered, and water we bill that's unmetered. All of that becomes our revenue water, and this is the only portion of the balance that actually generates us revenue. So we hope that's as big as it can be because that's what's generating the money for our system. Then we have our unbilled authorized consumption that is both unbilled metered and unbilled unmetered consumption. We have our apparent losses, which again include our unauthorized consumption or theft, customer meter errors, and systematic data handling errors. And then finally we have our real losses, which include mainline, service line leaks, and storage leaks and overflows. All of these categories at the bottom add up to our non-revenue water. So everything at the bottom down here is water that is not generating us revenue. If you look at the height of each of those columns, every column should add up to the same amount of water. So our volume from owned sources and imported water would be the same volume as revenue and non-revenue water on the other end. So every column adds up to the same amount. And the reason this really matters to us is we can't measure the real losses directly. So if we take one of the columns that we can measure, such as system inputs, and subtract the items we can measure, the billed authorized consumption, unbilled authorized, and apparent losses, we can figure out what the real losses are. So by knowing that all of these different columns add up to the same amount really helps us in figuring out how much water is in each of these categories. So we want the water balance to help us estimate the water that's going out where we don't want it to go and the revenue that we're not getting, because those are the two big questions. One option would be to use the water balance just to put in flows directly in every category and try to do the math to figure out where everything is. But that would be a little bit difficult. So there's an easier way to do this, and it uses the AWWA Water Audit software tool. This tool is free on the AWWA website. You will have to register, but the registration is free. And if you search their website or go to awwa.org/water loss control, you can find the latest version of the AWWA Water Audit software tool, download it, and use it. I will tell you that you need to have Excel running on your computer in order to use the software, but other than that, it should work on pretty much any computer. It might look a little scary, but it's not quite as bad as it looks. When you get the software, the white boxes are places you can put inputs. The yellow boxes are calculated for you. Some of the items aren't going to apply to you, and some of the items have defaults, so it really cuts down the number of data entries that you need to make. And as an added benefit, you can actually learn a lot about your system by actually doing the audit and gathering the information to put in the audit. So getting started with using the AWWA Water Audit software, we want to set the parameters for doing the audit. So we want to know what area the audit entails, so establishing our boundaries. You have a choice of doing the entire system and just saying all the inputs and outputs are going to be looked at, or a portion of the system. In order to do a portion of your system, you would have to be able to account for all the flows into that area and all the flows out of that area. So normal systems would probably use the entire system, but there are a few specific cases where a smaller area might work well for you. One of those cases is if you're in a regional entity where maybe 2 or 3 systems have joined together. They're now one system, and there's one pipe that connects the 2 or 3 individual entities or however many entities together. And you can just use the water audit software to do an audit for each of those separate entities, even though they're connected by that one main pipe. So there might be some times when you look at different boundaries, but for the most part, you're going to use the boundary as your whole system. You're also going to set the time period. The AWWA audit is an annual process, so you wouldn't want to use it to see what's happening just in, say, March. You would want to do a whole year's worth of data, or otherwise you'll get too many errors in the calculations. So again, think of it as an annual process. You can either do a calendar year going from January to December, or you can do a fiscal year. Your fiscal year might be July 1 to June 30th, or it might be the same as the federal year, October 1 to September 30th. Whatever it is, you can enter the dates of your own personal fiscal year. The units of measure are millions of gallons, megaliters, or acre feet. They have to be consistent across the entire audit, and most likely you're going to use millions of gallons. Most U.S. utilities will. But there are a few utilities that may have meters from somewhere else that read in liters, and in that case you could use megaliters. So the next step after you set those parameters is to assemble the records that you need and the data that you need to get started. So we're going to take a closer look at how the water audit software works. Okay, so moving on to the next step. So the data you need to use the water audit software falls into 5 categories. So we have data about the water we supply to our system, information about the water we deliver to our customers, information about our system characteristics, things like length of mains and pressure, that sort of thing, some financial information, and then there's some other information you might want to collect that doesn't go directly into the water audit, but could really help you in doing water loss control. We won't talk a lot about the other information, but some of the information that fits in here is collecting main break data. There's not any place in the audit we're going to directly enter information about our leaks and breaks on our mains, but knowing where they're occurring, how they're occurring, the date, that sort of thing can tell you a whole lot about your system and can help you in a lot of different ways. So that kind of data is really worth collecting, even though it isn't directly going to be entered into your water audit. Some things to think about as you gather data to do your water audits. Your data most likely was not generated for the purpose of water auditing, particularly that data that comes out of the billing system. And it may be great for the purpose that it was intended, but it may not always fit your needs for water auditing. So for example, a billing system is designed to provide bills, and it does that very well. It may or may not produce the volumes of water you want very well. So as an example, if your billing software says if a customer changes during the year, and so customer A was there until June, customer B came in July and picked up the meter after that, we archive the volume from December to June or January to June, put that in another place, and the billing software only maintains information from July forward. Well, for billing purposes, that may be perfectly fine, but for water auditing purposes, that's not so good. We really need to know the flow from January to June. That was that customer A's flow. So keep things like that in mind, that sometimes the data is great for what it was meant for, but not quite so great for our purposes in water auditing, and you'll have to do a little bit of investigating to see what changes you could make to make the data more appropriate for water auditing. There are going to be inconsistencies, anomalies, issues, concerns with your data. You may have to address those issues before you enter it into the software, or you may just build over time. You may investigate those issues, see where the problems are. Initially, you may not even know all your problems, so you're really going to have to take some time to really dig into the data and find those issues with the data. And then over time, you can really change your data and how you collect it to make it more appropriate for water auditing over time. That may be a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. It doesn't really matter as long as you're moving forward to make it a little bit easier to use in the future. So just keep that in mind, that even though you may not start out with things exactly the way you want them, you can change over time to make it a little bit easier for you to do your water audit. So another thing to think about is, how is your data collected? Is it by hand? Is it electronic? Is it a combination of both? And where is your data stored? Who has your data? It may be in multiple people's hands. It's highly unlikely that one person can do an entire water audit by themselves unless the system is extremely small and that's all you have working at your utility. Usually you're going to need some assistance between an operator, a financial person, maybe a manager, who can collect all the information together. And if you're not used to talking to the people in the billing department or who run your billing system, you're going to have to establish a relationship with them and really work with them to get the data you need for the water audit software. So again, it's going to be something that you'll have to kind of work in collaboration to get all the data you need. You might be thinking, after hearing about the data and the data needs, that you don't have good enough data or you don't know what's going on in your system. Could you really do a water audit? And the answer is yes, you can. It doesn't really matter how little you know about the system today. You still want to try to enter as much data as possible into the software, make assumptions for data that you have to, accept the fact that the data is not going to be everything you want it to be. But until you get started, you don't really know what to change or what to improve. So sitting back and trying to just wait until things get better is not going to work for you. You really want to jump in with both feet, get started, use the data at whatever quality it's at, and then move forward from there in future years to make things better. We'll talk a little later about how you can value that data and judge the data to know how good the data is. But for right now, just keep in mind, you can go ahead and get started with whatever data you have and improve it over time. Beginning the water audit starts with the instructions page. And it's a little bit strange terminology to think that the water audit starts with instructions. Typically, we think of instructions as a place we only go to when we get in trouble. But in the case of the water audit software, the instructions is where we enter our basic information about the water utility, and you won't be able to use the software correctly if you don't start with the instructions page. So here we're going to enter information, contact information, and system information, just basic stuff about address and PWS ID number, that type of thing. And if you don't know your PWS ID number, that's okay. The software will work without you entering that information. You have to choose the calendar year or fiscal year here. So you'll get to select type. If you click in that box that says select type, you'll get a choice that says financial year or calendar year. You can pick whichever one you want. And then if it's a calendar year, the start date and end date go away. If it's a financial year, you can put in the start date and end date for your particular financial year. And the water audit software will not work if you don't do this. Then you also have to do the volume reporting units. You can choose, again, between millions of gallons, megaliters, or acre feet. And again, the software will not work if you don't put in your volume reporting units. It will not be able to calculate numbers and that sort of thing. So you have to put at least the calendar year, fiscal year, and the volume reporting units for the software to work. Some of the other information you could skip, but those things you have to do. This is a completed instructions page just to sort of show you what it would look like if you're completely done. Our next step is to develop our inputs. This is where we put all of the data about what's going on with our system, the volume supplied, the volume the customers use, etc. That'll all go in on this reporting worksheet. So the first part of the worksheet will be all the water that we supply to our system. So this will include the volume from our own sources, the water we import, and the water we export. We're going to have one number for the entire year for each of these categories. So, for example, if we supplied to our system 32 million gallons, we would put 32 in that box because it'll be in millions of gallons per year. If you do not import water or you don't export water, you can just leave that blank. And then you don't have to fill anything in. Next, we'll put in any errors that the meters that are reading the volumes that we supply might have. So these could be meters that are on our wells, meters for surface water sources. They can be our water imported meters and our water exported meters. We can only put one number in there, and it's either a percentage, which would be the left-hand side, or a value, which is the right-hand side, and you have your choice of doing either one. You only can put in one percentage or one value. So if you have multiple meters, you have to do a flow weighted average of all their errors. So you may have 3 or 4 meters. You would figure out the error for each of those meters. And based on the proportion of flow that goes through each meter, you can figure out one number that would be the error for that meter. And you'll do this for all of your meters, the volume from own sources, the water imported, and the water exported. If it's an overread, you're going to put a positive number. If it's an underread, you're going to put a negative number in the box. So here's an example where the water audit software has shown that the water supplied is a bigger number than the volume from own sources based on the under registration of those master meters. So we put in 16.897. We said it was a negative 5.05% underread, and that gave us a total volume supplied of 17.795, and that yellow value is calculated for you. So that isn't something you have to do. The software will do it for you. If we have everything, the volume that we supply, we import water and export water, we would put a number in each of the categories. We would put a master meter error for each of those, and the water audit software will calculate for us the total water supplied, taking into account each of those meter errors. So it's really nice because it will do the calculations for you for each of those errors that occurred in your system. The next step is to enter our customer data. So in the customer data, we're going to put in the billed meter data, and this is all the data or all the water we provide to customers that runs through a meter, and that customer gets a bill. So hopefully that comes out of your billing software, and they can give you information for the total amount of water that passed through the meters for the year. And then you'll enter any billed unmetered data. In this case, these are your customers that you have on the system, but they don't actually have a meter at the house. You will have to estimate that flow because there isn't a meter reading. So you'll have to use something, criteria from engineering textbooks and that sort of thing to say, well, how much water does a typical customer use during the year, and use that factor to figure out how much water to put there. Clearly, if you don't have meters on your customer sources or customer uses, it will be a less accurate audit because you're just guessing at the use instead of figuring out through metering. The next part is unbilled metered, and again, these are customers, they have a meter, but they're not getting a bill. And hopefully, again, your billing software tracks customers using some separate code. If not, you might have to develop a separate software or a separate spreadsheet or something like that to track the meter readings. So if they're not tracked through your billing system, you'll probably have to track them separately. And then finally, we have our unbilled, unmetered usage. In this case, you have two choices. The first choice is to use the default that AWWA supplies for you, and it's 1.25% of the volume supplied. So if you use the default, the water audit software will calculate the value for you of how much water that is. The other choice is for you to do an estimate yourself, where maybe you look at how much flushing you're doing and the time of flush and approximately the gallons per minute for the flush, and you can make some estimates of how much water is used this way, or maybe the fire department tracks the fire flow and you can enter in your own value. Most of the time when you're just starting out your water audit, you'll just use the default value, and over time you can figure out ways to estimate the unbilled, unmetered usage in your system and get a better value, one that's more accurate for your utility later on. Then we move on to apparent losses. In the case of apparent losses, again, there's three things. It's the unauthorized consumption or theft, it's the customer meter errors, and the systematic data handling errors. So the little gray box that's right here shows the default percentage for the unauthorized consumption. So if you don't know anything about your system, you can choose to use a default percentage of 0.25%. If you've ever tracked theft or you've caught people with theft and you know that it's higher than this value, you can actually click over here and you can enter in a value in millions of gallons per year for how much theft has occurred in your system. You cannot change the default percent That's a locked field, so that value will always stay the same. For customer meter inaccuracies, the box is red. It's the only red one in the whole audit. But you are able to enter a data point there. You can enter a 1 to 10%, anything less than 10%. And then if you would rather, you can enter millions of gallons per year by toggling to the value. And then finally, systematic data handling errors, similar to unauthorized consumption. There's a default value for you of 0.25%. If you don't know anything about how the data is handled and the errors that might be there, you would want to just use the default. As you move along, you'll probably move over to really digging into your data and trying to figure out better values, and then you can use the value rather than the default. Based on all the inputs we've done thus far, we can have the software calculate for us the non-revenue water. So based on all these inputs in yellow, it will calculate non-revenue water. It will also tell us the authorized consumption, so the total authorized consumption that we've had. It will tell us what the apparent losses are, and it will calculate our real losses by taking our water losses minus our apparent losses. So again, as we mentioned before, real losses are calculated for you based on that idea of all the columns of water add up to the same amount. We also enter a few bits of information that are not directly related to calculating our water losses. These are related to some metrics that you'll get. So you enter some things like the length of mains, the number of active and inactive service connections, the location of your customer meters or curb stops, the average length of customer service line if the curb stops are not at the property boundaries, and then an average operating pressure. Most of this data is not too hard to come by. The average operating pressure might be a little bit difficult if you have a very complicated system. But again, you can start off with a good assumption of what it might be and then use over time, take some more readings and do some more things to get a better handle on what the average operating pressure is. Then our final inputs are financial. This is going to be used to value our real losses and apparent losses and our unbilled authorized usage. So we need to know a couple of things. One is the total cost to operate the utility for the year, and that's dollars per year. Then we're going to have our customer retail unit cost. This is our dollars per 1,000 gallons that we charge customers. This doesn't include the base bill. This is a number that's looking at the dollars per 1,000 you charge your customers. You can only put one number in here. So if you have a complicated rate structure, you have to do a little bit of math to flow weight residential and non-residential customers. Customers that are using lower amounts of water in one tier versus customers that use water in another tier. But it's not terrible math. It can be done. And also for the first year, if you want to just start with a very simple number of what you charge the first tier in dollars per 1,000, start there. You can always improve that number over time. And then finally, we have our variable production cost. And this is what we talked about before that values real losses. This is a dollars per million gallons number, and it takes our energy and chemical costs divided by the total millions of gallons we produce, and that gives us a dollars per million gallons that it costs us to create the water. And what you hope is that your dollars per million gallons to produce the water is a lot lower than the dollars per 1,000 gallons that you're charging your customers so that you're making money to cover your other costs. So one handy feature in the water audit software is a section called the comments field. And you click on the comments, and every single one of the inputs has an opportunity for you to write comments. So just a couple of examples. This audit has a general comment. This is our first audit. We met to discuss data. Joe provided, certain data. Mabel provided other data. I mean, it's just an example of the type of thing you could write for unbilled, unmetered. There's some information on how that was estimated. So there's all kinds of things you can do with the comments field. You want to become very good friends with the comment field. Put as much information as possible, because it's very difficult to remember from year to year what you're doing in the water audit how you came up with values, estimates, etc. So the data that you're going to put in your water audit is not going to be completely accurate. There's going to be errors, there's going to be things that have happened. We talked about some things with the billing software, or how you've written down numbers, or the types of meters you have. There's a lot of problems that could go into the data collection. So in order to address that issue, we have something called data grades, that we put a data grade beside each entry point to give us some idea of the quality of that data that we put in there. So how do we know what data grade to put in there? There's a couple different ways. One is you can hover over the red triangle in the corner, and up will pop a data grades box that shows you what you have to do to get the various numbers. Every data grade is NA, non-applicable, or 1 to 10. So each data grade goes from 1 to 10, or it's not applicable. If you did not put a value in the box, you do not have to put a data grade. So we're only having to grade the data that we actually input into our system. The pop-up boxes can be a little hard to read. They're a little hard to interpret. So the Southwest Environmental Finance Center developed data grade spreadsheets to help you select the proper data grade. You can obtain them for free from our website at southwestefc.unm.edu, or just search for Southwest Environmental Finance Center or Southwest EFC and you will find us. Go to Services, Water Loss Control, pick Resources, and under Resources you will see a chance to get the water audit data grading sheets. They are files that you can just download, print, and use. There is one sheet for every data input, and you can skip any sheet if you haven't had that type of input. And every one of the data grades is related to practices, policies, procedures, and occasionally results. So you're going to be looking at certain things, like, for example, the volume of owned sources is related to 3 things: the percent of water production sources that you meter, the meter accuracy testing and calibration, and the results, and the accuracy of the meter. So there's certain things that it will be asking you questions about, and based on your practices in these 3 areas, you'll rate yourself from a 1 to a 10. The way you'll do this is you look at a starting point, say 1, and can I meet or exceed all of the criteria in that number 1? So if I can, I would move up to the next highest number. If I can't, I would move down. So when I get to 2, if I can't check any of those boxes, I would move down and stay at a 1. It's a little confusing because it's meet or exceed. So some of the terminology sounds a little funny to be able to check. So for example, it says less than 25% of water production sources are metered. Remaining sources are estimated under number 1. So you might think, well, if I have more than 25%, I shouldn't check the box. But it's meet or exceed. So if you're better than what it says there, you can check the box. Or if you meet what it says, you can check the box. So just keep that in mind, that if you're better than what it says, then you can check the box because you exceeded it. Now we have a few cases where there's something called conditions between 2 and 4, or conditions between 4 and 6. You fit that data grade if you checked all of the number below and some of the number above. So the example on the screen right now shows both of the factors on 2 were checked. One of the factors on number 4 were checked. So this particular utility would be a data grade 3. We will enter the data grades to the left of each of our entry points in that small box to the left. And the most important thing about the data grades is to make sure that you're honest about what the data grade should be. The right data grade is the one that reflects your system accurately and carefully. You do not want to just go in and put 10 everywhere, because it will throw you off and you won't have the right information to move forward. So you really want to be honest and have it reflect the system as best you can. Once you put in all the data grades, if you've missed any, it will say, add a data grade for 2 parameters or 3 or 4 or 1. And you have to go back up and try to find the place where you might have missed putting in the data grade. And often one that's missed is the customer meter inaccuracies, because in that particular case, you put the value in the red box, but the data grade is over to the left, not directly beside the customer meter inaccuracy. So if you get one where it says you're missing one parameter, that's a logical place to look because that might be the one you're missing. If you don't put all the data grades in, you will not be able to move on. It won't give you the results. Once we put all the data grades in, we get an overall water audit data validity score. In this particular example, the score is 49 out of 100. So we might think about, what does that score mean to us? A general rule of thumb is we'd like a score of 50 out of 100 in order to really move on to some of the tools that you can use to reduce water losses or non-revenue water. If it's below 50, you're much better off working on the data further, trying to get that validity score up, maybe changing some policies, practices, procedures. So generally 50 or above, we might do a combination of looking at our data validity and doing some activities. If we're below 50, we'll probably be mostly looking at our data. The water audit software will also tell us where the best places to look to increase our validity score. The volume from own sources is commonly the first item on the list because that has the biggest impact overall on the water balance. And we do not have an equal weight of data grades. So the data grade for how many customer connections you have is a lot lower than the volume from own sources or, say, the metered billed data or something like that. So there's a lot of weighting that goes on, and the software will tell you the 3 best places to look to have the most impact on improving your validity score. So again, your response, if it's less than 50, you want to spend more time on data. If it's greater than 50, you might do a combination of looking at your data as well as taking some results. So the results of the water audit provide 3 things. It provides the blue part of the problem, the volumes, and where the water is going, particularly the non-revenue water, where is the water going that I would prefer it not to go. It gives us the green problem, the values of water, so how much non-revenue water is in each category based on dollars. And then finally, it gives us that validity, the confidence we have in our data. So here's the results page. You wouldn't enter any data here. These are performance indicators that you would get by filling out all of the water audit software information. It's going to summarize your apparent losses and real losses into a total water loss. It's going to give you the annual cost of apparent losses and the annual cost of real losses. It gives you a couple of metrics, financial and volumetric in terms of percent real losses. You want to be really careful using the non-revenue water percent by volume supplied. In this case, it's 45.8. That's a little bit of a misleading metric, so you have to be careful using that. Then there's a couple of other metrics down here that just give you real losses and apparent losses based on service connections and length of mains and things like that. So there's some really good information there that kind of helps you look at your data and what it means. There's also the dashboard that kind of shows you graphically where the water is going. And the bar on the right is the non-revenue revenue water split. In this case, they're pretty close to 50-50. Maybe about 55% is revenue water and 45% is non-revenue water. You also get on the dashboard a chance to look at the non-revenue water in both cost and volume. So on the left-hand side, the bar chart is showing the cost of non-revenue water, and on the right side is showing the volume. In this particular case, this utility had a difference between what cost the most and what was causing the highest volume. So the highest cost was related to customer meter inaccuracies, but the highest volume of water, non-revenue water, was in real water losses. So as this utility moved forward, they could look at things to see what would affect my revenue the most and what would affect my non-revenue volume the most, because there's 2 different things. So looking at this information kind of helps you decide how to move forward, what actions to take. The water balance is also filled out by the software. So when we first looked at that water balance at the very beginning, we talked about how you could actually enter volumes in there directly, but it would be very difficult to do so. This is a case where the water audit software has produced that balance for us. So this is an output we get based on filling in the information. It will tell us what the balance looks like and how much flow in each of the categories. So that's an output you get out of the software. So what do we do next? Once we know our blue problem, our green problem, and our confidence, what do we do next? Well, part of the issue is that there's a lot of different things that you can do. There isn't one tool that would address all of your water concerns, your non-revenue water concerns. There are tools that address various pieces. So we've developed this toolbox that kind of gives you some ideas of what kind of tools that you could use to address different types of water loss and what the cost range would be. So on the left-hand side, it talks about what kind of losses or non-revenue water it addresses, what the tool is, and what the cost range is from low to high. So a tool that doesn't cost very much but has a big impact on a volume or on a revenue, that blue or the green issue, would be a very good tool to put in place. So the way this is ordered, the tools at the top are validity-based tools. Then we have our authorized unbilled usage tools, followed by apparent loss tools, and then finally our real loss tools at the bottom. And again, we want to remember that it's going to take multiple tools to address your non-revenue water, and you really want to consider what is the benefit I could get out of that tool and what is the cost of that tool before you actually go and use them. Okay, so if you take the time to do your water audit, check the data, there are really costs and benefits of doing that. And think about what things you can do at your own facility based on what you learned today. So you could download the water audit software. You could start gathering your data. You could start to enter data that, at least initially, you feel is pretty, is the best you can get, for example, on the volume from own sources, the volumes that you sell and purchase, your customers, all that sort of thing. Just gather the data and do as much as you can at your own system. And don't let what you can't do stop you from doing what you can. So maybe you can't do everything you would like. Maybe you don't have all the data you want. Just move forward with whatever you do have. Leave things blank. Use the comments field to indicate why or how you've estimated the values you put in there. If you have to do a very rough estimate right up front, that's okay. Just go through the first one, and then it will get better over time. And you can type in any questions you have from the webinar, and we'll try to answer those today. However, if you need help and you would like to start a water audit process, we do have technical assistance available under this Smart Management for Small Water Systems contract. You can always contact me or Dawn. Our contact information is on the screen now, and ask for help. You can also go to the efcnetwork.org website. There is a place to ask for assistance on the website. So feel free to reach out to us if you're just trying to get started and you don't know what to do or how to move forward, or you get stuck on something, please reach out to us and let us know. We're here to help. So with that, I'll ask Dawn if any questions have been entered in during the webinar.
Yes, we have a really great question. How do you get the master meter error value?
Okay, so the way we would get that is you actually have to have somebody come in and check your master meter. And there's a couple of things that they'll be looking for when they check it. And it's most likely something you will have to have an outside person come in and do, unless you're a very big utility with a lot of sophisticated equipment. But it's not a tremendously expensive thing to do. So you'll hire a company, they'll come in, they'll check, first of all, is your meter itself accurate? So they want to look at, does that meter work properly? All the internal components are functioning and the meter is able to read correctly. And then they'll look at, is the meter reading correctly in its installation? So you have the meter in a pipe, and that pipe may have fittings like valves or elbows or things like that, reducers, increasers in it. And if it does, it could affect the flow through the meter. So the meter might be reading accurately, but because the flow path has been disrupted by those fittings, it may not read correctly, even though the meter itself is in good shape, is not reading properly because of the installation. And then the last thing you kind of want to look at is the electronics related to the meter. So if there's anything where it's sending a signal, is it sending the appropriate signal? We've had some cases where the electronics thought the meter was a 8-inch meter, but it's actually a 10-inch meter, and so the flow rate is not being calculated properly. So they would look at all three of those things, and they would check it under different flow conditions and try to tell you how accurate that meter is. So it's not something that you would know without somebody checking your meter. So initially, if you haven't had your meters tested, just as a starting place, we usually assume that meters are not going to be 100% accurate, even if they're new. So you might just start with, say, a 1% overread or underread, just as a starting place, and write in the comment section, you know, we know that the meter is probably not accurate, and we don't know what the error is, so we're just going to start with this value. And you could, you know, use that as your starting place, and then try to build in your budget a little bit of money to get your master meters checked in the future. If you have more than one, you might do one per year. Ideally, you do them all, but if you don't have the funding, you could do one this year and one next year. And again, just to get some feel for what's going on in your system.
All right. I don't think we have any other questions coming in at this time, so I think we have some information for Savannah and a closing poll, so I will turn it over to Savannah.
So I just want to thank you, Heather, for the in-depth look at water audits as the first part of water loss control. And I want to thank Dawn for moderating today's session. And thanks to all the attendees for joining us today. Heather, I will throw it back to you for any additional closing comments.
I just want to thank everybody for attending today. And just as a reminder, if you would like to get started in water auditing and feel a little bit unsure of where to get started, please reach out to us. We're happy to help you just get started on things. So again, good luck, and hopefully you can start and complete a water audit for this year, and then every year after that, work a little bit at a time to improve the numbers and the information. And it will provide you benefits if you can reduce that non-revenue water. So thank you very much for being here today.
All right. Have a great afternoon.